Boldwood presents The Sisters Next Door, written by L.H. Stacey and read by Karen Cass. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood.
Chapter 1. Swinging her car onto the single-track lane, Molly cringed as the suspension gave an instant groan of displeasure, and immediately she wished she'd put more items into the furniture van rather than filling her trusty old Astra estate up to the gunnels. Its load was now far too heavy for the car, especially on a potholed lane like this one. Narrowing her tear-filled eyes, she tried to focus. The darkness was surrounding them quickly, casting long, eerie shadows, and she found herself slowing the vehicle, looking up at the cliffs that towered vertically to one side of the car, and felt herself almost cowering away with a fear she couldn't understand as she took in their vast and impeding height. The sight was made even more intimidating by randomly planted trees. Most were old and gnarly, with long, overhanging branches, all of which reached out to resemble long, spindly arms that seemed to be grabbing at the car. To the other side of the lane, the view couldn't have been more different, and Molly gasped, in awe of the vast and rugged North Yorkshire coastline. The long sweeping beach and the pretty little fishing town of Filey. Her view only slightly obstructed by two small properties, each balanced precariously on the cliff top, with just enough space between the buildings and the cliff edge to save them from falling into the sea. It was a thought that made her shudder. The reality of living in such a remote place had suddenly become real, and she blew out a long, slow breath, while carefully manoeuvring her car along the lane, through the rainwater that had collected and pooled outward from the edge of the road, and warily she tried her best to avoid the grass verge that had already turned into a furrowed and dangerous quagmire. Molly slowed the car, leaned forward, sighed. She knew she had to stay calm, had to believe that moving here to this house was the right thing to do, and while taking deep, measured breaths, she switched off her car's engine, took a moment to gaze at the view, mesmerized by the way the waves dramatically increased in size. Each one rolling forward, bigger and stronger than the one before. Each commanding its place in the sea, before finally throwing itself violently towards the shore in one final explosive gesture. Opening the car window, Molly took in a deep breath of fresh, salty sea air, her eyes constantly on the coastline, where clouds scuttled moodily across a sky that was getting darker by the minute. A rumble of thunder echoed somewhere in the distance, a sound that left her with no doubt that an impending storm was heading their way, and she wondered how long it would be before the rain came down, and when it did, how torrential it would be. Keeping one eye on the rearview mirror, she hoped that the removal van would miraculously appear. Yet quickly she realised that getting a van of that size along this lane during a storm could prove to be a challenge. "Hello, Earth to Molly!" Her teenage sister Beth waved a hand up and down in front of her face. "Please tell me that isn't it." She rolled her eyes and pointed to one of the two cliff-top houses. Both were unkempt, but one was dramatically worse than the other. "I am not living there. Not a chance." Rummaging in her bag, she dragged her phone from its depths and slumped back in her seat to stare aimlessly at its screen. Molly bit down on her lip, hesitated, picked up a clear plastic folder the solicitor had given her. "No, this one's ours." She pointed to the picture. "From what I remember, it's just a bit further along the lane, round the corner. You'll see it in a minute." Dropping the folder in the footwell, she waved a hand at the sea. "I was just taking a moment to look at the bay. That'll be the view we get from the house. It's beautiful, isn't it?" Beth tutted, curled her lip in disgust, flicked her long copper hair away from her face, kicked off her shoes, and lifted her bare feet to rest against the glove box. "I suppose so, if you like that sort of thing. Personally, I'd rather go back to Dan's. I liked it there. Dan was nice." "We couldn't stay at Dan's forever, and—" Molly sucked in her breath. "Well, it was getting awkward, wasn't it?" she said through gritted teeth. "Since me and Dan split up, I found it difficult. So it was time to move on, time to come here, and since we had to give Mum's house back, we had nowhere else to go. You do know that, don't you? Looking down and into the passenger footwell, she focused on her handbag, thought about the letter within, feared for what it meant, what repercussions it would bring, and wished for life to be different. Right, Beth spat back. So I'm supposed to be grateful that we inherited a house that stands on the edge of a bloody cliff, am I? Well, sorry if I'm not overjoyed, Molly, but I didn't want to move, not again, and what's more, we shouldn't have had to inherit anything. Our mum, she should be here, and coming here doesn't feel right, not without her. Molly glanced at her sister, felt her pain. Hun, she caught her breath, didn't know what to say. We couldn't stay at Dan's. When I asked if we could move in, he wasn't as overjoyed as you might think. Looked as though he'd been offered a glass of arsenic. And I thought he'd be okay eventually, but he started acting all cagey. She carefully thought about her words. I think this house, our new home, came through at just the right time. He was only acting cagey, as you put it, because he wanted you back. He still wants you back. Beth gave her hopeful eyes. He loves us, Moll. I just know he does. Molly could feel her sister's heartbreak. She loved Dan like a brother, and it was more than obvious that she felt like the middle sibling of two others who had quarrelled, and she was doing everything she could in the hope that everyone would shake hands and make friends. Sighing, Molly rolled her eyes. She needed to find a way to pacify her sister, to get her on side without telling her the truth, without destroying yet another part of her life. Besides, you're 15 now, you're growing far too fast, and that terrifies me. You really need your own space, your own bedroom, not one you share with an older sister. She smiled, dropped her hand affectionately on Beth's leg. And, not to put too fine a point on it, I want my own space too. Beth squirmed in her seat, wriggled her toes and stared at her feet, which were still balanced on the glove box. Did Mum ever sleep here, at the house? Molly laid a hand over Beth's. Sure she did. She spent time here with Michael. They loved each other. She was finally happy, Beth. She was planning a life. That had to count for something, didn't it? Closing her eyes, she nodded, thought of how their mother had tried to convince them to move here with her, how they'd both selfishly resisted. Neither had wanted to move, neither had wanted the long commute to school or to work. Neither had wanted yet another father figure in their lives. Molly might have felt differently if she'd known her own father, but she hadn't. He was a childhood sweetheart, a boy I met at school, her mother had always told her. He was a kind young man, with beautiful eyes that looked just like yours, but he went away to university. We lost touch. He didn't even know you existed, and the last I heard, he'd died. It was a tragic, meaningless accident. She'd always looked wistful when she spoke, as though trying to keep the picture of his face permanently preserved in her mind, making Molly wonder what would have happened if he'd lived and what kind of life they'd have had if he were around and came over to visit. Michael dying changed everything for all of us, didn't it? Beth put her phone down, flicked at the zip on her school bag. It did. Our mum hadn't known him long. Seemed very happy. And when he died, it was as though all her dreams died with him. All her plans. Blinking away the tears, Molly smiled awkwardly. When the solicitor rang Mum and told her that Michael had left her the house, she started planning again. Started looking forward. Making a new life she wanted us to be a part of, and all of us living here together was what she dreamed of. Beth held both hands out, palms up. And instead of starting again, she went and got herself murdered, didn't she? And then somehow we got to move here without her. Arrogantly, she held two thumbs up in the air and spat the words, So yay! How lucky are we? Molly once again took her younger sister's hand. Beth, don't be like that. Please give it a chance. With a half smile, she closed her eyes for just a moment, tried to think of the right thing to say, felt totally inept. Did I ever tell you that Mum used to bring me here? She tried to think of a nice story, pointed to the beach. We'd spend hours and hours making the biggest sand castles with really deep moats. I'd fill them with seawater using my little pink plastic bucket. She took a deep breath, blew it out, and made an attempt to stop the tears from flowing. I'd always have a flag, one of those plastic ones that had been glued onto a long straw, and she wiped a tear from her eye. I used to make Mum stand up and salute the waves while we placed the flag on the top of the castle. Beth looked thoughtful, took her feet down from the glove box, sat forward and stared at the beach. I guess you didn't think too much about the environment back then, did you? You do realise that all those bloody straws will still be out there, don't you? They'll be floating around, killing the wildlife for up to 200 years. Her hand suddenly became animated and made a wave-like motion in the air. They're probably still out there, causing chaos, she said accusingly. Molly went silent. A surge of guilt swept through her conscience. You're absolutely right, she agreed. We didn't know any better then. She shook her head, knew it had been wrong, but couldn't help but wish for the simplicity her life used to have. A time when she'd been a child, young, naive, happy, and her only responsibility had been getting up and going to school. Leaning back in her seat, Beth flicked the screen of her phone, lifted it to the window, and clicked to take a photo. You once told me she'd brought me to this beach. Is it true? She asked wistfully, her eyes never leaving the beach or the dog that ran playfully in and out of the water. Sure it is, Molly laughed, rolled her eyes to the ever-darkening sky. The last time we came, you were a very excited toddler, around 2 years old. I'd have been 10 or 11, and I remember you escaping Mum's clutches. You set off, running across the sand and straight into the sea, where a massive wave tossed you up in the air, and you landed back on the beach with a thud. Mum must have thought you were about to drown because she screamed so loud that my ears literally rang for hours. Molly furrowed her brow while trying to remember. Suddenly she saw Charlie's face, the fury he'd shown that day. What is it? Beth questioned. I just remembered your dad, Charlie. He went mental with a man who saw you running away from Mum. You were running towards the steps, screaming, and he jumped up, scooped you up from the beach, and, well, I thought Charlie was going to kill him. I'd never seen him so cross. Scared me to death. Her words trailed off as the memory faded. Huffing, Beth threw her arms in the air. So let me get this straight. We've ended up inheriting a house that's perched on a cliff that overlooks the very same beach where I was almost killed and then abducted as a 2-year-old. She shuffled in her seat, tutted. Well, thanks. She paused, looked skyward. A single tear dropped down Molly's face. The months had taken their toll. Overnight, their lives had turned into an unpredictable roller coaster, one that wouldn't or couldn't stop. And now, as well as everything else, they were moving into a house they didn't want, in a town that was miles away from the life they'd known, and taking the first daunting steps into an existence they couldn't possibly understand. For the first time in their lives, they'd be living alone, just the two of them. Something that Molly had both looked forward to and dreaded in equal measure. And now they were here. She took a deep breath, stared at the sea, at the beach, wished for answers, for the knowledge that whatever happened, she'd be able to keep Beth safe, keep them both safe. And she shook her head, knowing full well that she couldn't promise either. Chapter 2. Seriously, Moll, have you seen the length of this lane? Beth tutted as Molly turned the car. There isn't even a proper path, and I can't believe we have to travel up and down it twice a day just to get me to school and back. Molly wrinkled her nose, shook her head and paused. Once again her eyes went to her handbag. To the letter. Was it wrong to keep the truth to herself? We, she emphasised the word before continuing, we don't have to drive along here at all, but you, young lady, you do have to walk, she said apologetically. School bus pulls up at the top of the road, right over there. She pointed to a distant car park that stood along the roadside. 8:15 every morning, she said, keeping up the pretense, But deep down she knew that on most days she'd be doing the driving, the protecting, the making sure Beth got on and off the bus safely. Blinking repeatedly, Beth huffed in frustration. "Oh, great. That's just great," she said, jutting out her chin in protest. "And I'm guessing that you'll provide the bloody welly boots too, will you?" Her hand went through her long hair, flicked it back from her pale, freckled face. "I mean, look, just look." She pointed her finger around in a wand-like fashion at the lane. There's mud. It's everywhere. Moll, my shoes will be ruined." She threw herself backwards in the seat and gave off a long, audible sigh, shuffled impatiently. "And the nearest shop, it's just got to be 1,000,000 miles away. And what about my friends? How am I going to get to see them? Dan drove me back and forth. I hardly ever had to catch a bus." Molly felt her patience wane. "You need to learn to look after yourself. Dan isn't your taxi service, and neither am I." She paused, placed her hands back on the steering wheel, and squeezed the leather. "If I'm going to work effectively, I need my sleep. You should try being a dentist. It isn't easy. Some days I just want to go home and lock the door. I don't always want to start getting the car out again and running you all over. Besides, we're miles away from York now, and it certainly wouldn't be a quick trip to pop you back and forth to friends." She thought of the days following her mother's death, all the patients she'd smiled at, when in reality all she'd wanted to do was throw the towel in, stay home and hide under the duvet, not go out for days, but knew that she couldn't. "Dan liked giving me a lift. He looked out for me," Beth insisted. "Well, if I know Dan, he'll be absolutely delighted to get both his car and his house back." Pressing her lips tightly together, Molly thought of Dan, of how much she'd previously loved him, and how, over the last couple of weeks, she'd felt more and more anxious in his company, feeling an immeasurable sense of relief when she'd been allowed to take possession of the house. Beth threw her arms up in the air. "I give up and I want to go back to York. I like living in the city, Moll. My friends are there, and here I don't know anyone." Taking in a deep, measured breath, Molly noted that her sister would have been more suited to attending a drama school rather than the local comprehensive. "You'll soon get to know people, and the nearest shop is in the next village. It's only a 2-minute drive away. And as for the house, we have no control over where it is, so please suck it up, because without it we're homeless. Mum left it to us and—" Molly added wistfully, "It's a new start, Beth. We should be grateful." "You're ruining my life," Beth suddenly growled. Her bottom lip wobbled, and her hands went up to her head, where she pressed them tightly to each side of her brow. "I know," Molly replied thoughtfully. She didn't know how to explain, couldn't grasp that she was suddenly a parent, wanted to tell her sister the truth but couldn't. "But I promised her, Beth. I went to her grave and I promised our mum that I'd look after you, that I'd bring you to live in this house." She pulled the file out of the footwell, laid it on her knee, with the picture of the house looking back at them. It's exactly what she'd have wanted. Placing a hand on Beth's shoulder, Molly stared directly into her eyes. Nodded. "Don't you see? This house, it's the perfect sanctuary. It could be our final move, a place we'll never have to leave." She smiled, arched a brow. "It's our chance to stop running, Beth. Our mum, I think she felt safe here, and what's more, I'm absolutely sure she'd have known how far it was to the bus stop and how annoyed you'd get about that lane." She gave her sister a slight smile, winked. Putting the car into gear, Molly carefully squeezed the pedal, manoeuvred slowly along the track. It was getting darker and more eerie by the minute, and while struggling to avoid the furrows that defined each side of the lane, she turned the corner, spotted the house, hit the brakes at the last minute, and with a jolt and a thud, she watched as the once white picket fence began to wobble and fall. Flinging the car door open in disgust, Beth pushed her shoes back onto her feet and stepped into the breeze that immediately whipped her hair up and around in all directions, making her grab at it with one hand while slamming the door with the other. Watching her sister go, Molly followed, took a quick look at the damaged fence and shrugged. It was probably about to fall down anyway, she whispered to herself, then made her way along the cobbled path and towards the front door. As a child, she'd often sat on the beach below, looked up and commented on how beautiful this very house had looked. But now, as she got closer, she noticed the disrepair, the overwhelming look of being worn and unloved. Even the climbing plant that used to grow around the front door had long since withered and died, along with the many shrubs and plants that were fighting a losing battle among the brambles and bindweed. "Bloody hell, Moll, are we seriously going to live in that? It looks even more of a dump than I imagined," Beth grunted as she walked back to the car, peered cautiously over the top, one hand taking pictures with her phone, the other still holding tightly to her hair. "Hey, language," Molly chided, gave Beth a look, adjusted her sunglasses that sat neatly on top of her head to create the perfect headband. "Okay, so I admit it's not quite as beautiful as it used to be, or even as good as it looked on the solicitor's paperwork. But with a bit of work, it'll be fine, you'll see," she said hopefully. She pushed her shoulder firmly against the front door and yelped. "Bloody hell, that's stiff." "Hey, language," Beth threw back, laughed, then froze. "Moll?" "What was that noise?" "What noise?" "Shh." Beth stood on her tiptoes, peered over the car in meerkat fashion. "I heard something." Stepping over the fallen fence, Beth walked along the path towards where Molly stood, tiptoed around the house, disappeared out of sight. "I'll be right back." "Beth, please." Feeling her anxiety rise, Molly stepped to one side, anxiously waited for Beth to come back, fought the urge to follow her. Beth, come and help me. I need you to help me open this door." Molly gave intermittent shoves with her shoulder, tipped her head from side to side, constantly looking for Beth. "There's something stopping it." Reappearing, Beth walked back to the car, shook her head. "Bloody hell, Moll, it's dark round there. I bet it gets real spooky at night. It'd be so easy to sleepwalk and fall off the cliff." Using the car as a barrier, she slid down next to the wheel, crouched near the floor, let go of her hair, allowed her attention to return to her phone, and frantically tapped at the screen before glaring in Molly's direction. "Moll, please tell me we have some bloody Wi-Fi." "Nope, no Wi-Fi, sorry. Be a few days till it's sorted." Standing back from the door, Molly crossed her arms and stared at her sister. "Are you going to help me?" Molly almost sang the words, couldn't wait to get in, felt her whole body buzz with an excitement that was interspersed with trepidation. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, whether it would be their best move ever or their worst nightmare. All she really did know was that there was no time for indecision, and for now they were both safe and together. Giving the door another push, Molly looked over her shoulder at Beth. She'd walked away from the car and now stood staring up at the roof, at the old dormer windows. Is that where he fell from?" Beth asked, pointing upwards, her face contorted with confusion. "Can you imagine him lying there, screaming?" Molly turned to where her sister pointed, swallowed hard and wished wholeheartedly that their mum had never revealed how Michael had died. "It was raining. He slipped." She spoke softly, but subconsciously she could hear his cries and wondered how long he'd lain on the patio at the back of the house before he was found. Turning, she looked down the lane. She could easily see the house next door, but the other was a little further around the corner, just one edge of it remained in view. Carefully she tried to judge the distance, wondered if either were inhabited, if there would have been anyone home, and even if they had been, whether they'd have heard his screams. She realised that with the cliff on one side and the sea on the other, it was more than doubtful. He'd been surrounded by the most perfect sound buffers, which could easily drown out any amount of noise and swallow it whole. It was just an accident, Beth, nothing more. "Well, the thought of him lying there for days, waiting to be found, it gives me the creeps." Beth spoke with a hysterical squeal. "And think of all the blood. There had to be some, didn't there?" "Beth, you're freaking yourself out. In fact," Molly waved a hand around in the air, "enough of the dramatics. You're freaking me out." "Hey, you think I'm being dramatic? It's you that wants to live here, not me. I wanted to stay at Dan's." She kicked at the car wheel in a temper, pushed out her bottom lip, stared at her feet, then bent down and, with a tissue, polished the dirt from her shoe. Turning her attention back to the door, Molly once again rammed it with her shoulder until just a small gap appeared. Convinced it would move no further, she knelt down and nervously pushed her hand through the space between the door and the jamb. There has to be something trapped behind it. She held her breath and closed her eyes, whilst almost lying on her side with one hand tentatively grasping at the space behind the door. I can feel... She opened her eyes and looked up at the threatening sky. Oh, I think it's a carpet. I just need to... Squeezing her arm further inside, she managed to wriggle her fingers until eventually she felt the door open to reveal what looked like a year's worth of post. Beth, we're in. Come look. Scrambling to her feet, Molly stepped inside to see that one large piece of carpet had been purposely wedged behind the door. The rest of the carpet had been haphazardly hacked at, and now just small, ragged remnants remained, still attached to the gripper. Crouching down, she tentatively began to poke at the envelopes and pushed the paper mountain out of her way. Oh, wow, so much post, so much crap. And oh boy, so many dead spiders. She made a mental note to bring the vacuum in from the car and pulled at what was left of the carpet in an attempt to flatten it back down. Pushing up the sleeves of her jumper, she stood up, walked along the hallway, and without a thought began pulling at nails that were still randomly scattered across the wall. Looks like all these walls were full of pictures. Looks like Michael's niece emptied the place. Even went as far as to rip up the bloody carpet and take it with her. Molly looked over her shoulder, caught sight of a small black and white picture that still hung on the wall. It was yellow with age, hung all by itself, forgotten, unwanted, and half hidden by the door. Lifting her hand, she ran a finger across the glass, where in the picture a young man was standing by the front door, smiling back at her. A child's bike lay at his feet. It was a picture full of sunshine, of family, and for a moment Molly just stared at it, feeling as though she'd seen it before. Michael. Was this you? She whispered. Then she stepped back, regretting she hadn't seen him more often, got to know him better, liked him more. You were a good-looking guy, I'll give you that. She paused, her fingertips hovering over the white picket fence, the same one she'd just destroyed. Taking the picture down from its hook, Molly placed it on the windowsill. She tipped her head from side to side, suddenly felt sad, and wondered if it might have been left behind on purpose. Your niece must have been really pissed that you didn't leave her the house, mustn't she? Molly sighed, heard the sound of the rolling thunder, of incoming gales, then Beth's voice, anxious and annoyed. Yeah, we're here. It's okay. It's 1,000,000 miles from civilization, and there isn't a shop anywhere in sight. And the wind up here, it bites. I might need to get a new coat because I'm freezing my bloody bits off. Conscious that the light outside was fading fast, Molly turned, flicked on a light switch, and then another. Damn, there's no electric. Moving up and down the hallway, she flicked at switches before turning back to the door. Beth, you need to come in here. The lights are out. We're going to have to find the fuse box. Allowing her hand to graze the staircase, she studied the carved oak and what looked to be a narrow cupboard door that was almost hidden in its frame. Pressing her fingers firmly against the wooden panel, she felt the door click, opened it to reveal a small but empty space, a place where coat hooks lined the back wall and a full-length mirror was fixed to the back of the door. The sight of her reflection made her scowl. Ugh! Molly lifted a hand, pulled her sunglasses off her head, flicked her fingers through her shoulder-length hair, and studied the shape of her body. The weight loss didn't suit her, nor did the dark furrowed lines below her eyes. Startled by a cobweb brushing against her face, she jumped backwards. Ugh, and you need to bugger off too. Go find somewhere else to live. Oh my God, what the hell did I do this time? Beth wailed, and Molly turned to see her sister standing in the doorway, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I wasn't talking to you, silly. I was talking to the damn spiders. They all need to go, she said decisively. That was Gran on the phone. Beth waved the phone round in the air. Says she hasn't seen us in forever. Made me feel really guilty. I kind of promised we'd go over. She raised both eyebrows, gave a half smile. "Tomorrow. I said we'd go tomorrow." Molly caught the smug way Beth crossed her arms and chose to ignore the comment. "I'm going to bring the vacuum out of the car, get rid of those little suckers." She looked at the place where all the spiders in North Yorkshire seemed to have taken up residence. "Oh, and if we can't find the fuse box, we really need to hope we packed some candles, otherwise it could get really dark up here tonight." She copied Beth's earlier mannerism, gave her a cheery thumbs up. "We might even have to hide under the duvet with torches, pretend we're camping." Beth stepped back, placed a fist firmly on each hip. "I don't want to sleep here, not while there's over 100 spiders running around the house." Inquisitively, she looked down the hallway, a slight smile of approval crossing her lips. "So I vote that we either go to the travel lodge or back to Dan's." "How about we do neither?" Molly chipped in. "OK, how about we order a pizza and camp in front of the fire, but only if there's electric and only if we get to suck the spiders up with the vacuum?" Beth tried to negotiate, looked hopefully towards the living room. "There is a proper fire, right?" Molly ran her fingers along the dado rail that circumnavigated the hall and cringed at the line in the dust she created. "If there is, and provided we can find something to light it with, we'll make a fire." She paused. "As for the pizza, I doubt the delivery guy would find us. You said it yourself. We're 1,000,000 miles from civilization." She mimicked her sister's voice, gave her a sarcastic smile. Sniffing at the air, Beth wrinkled her nose. "What's that funny smell?" "How should I know? House hasn't been lived in for ages." Molly raised her eyebrows, flicked her hair to one side. "I'm guessing the niece came and went, took what she wanted, including the damn carpet. Maybe we got lucky and she cleaned a little on her way out." Molly tapped her foot on the bare floorboards, while trying to mentally calculate how much money she had left in the bank, when her next payday would be, and whether or not she'd have enough left to buy a carpet. Pressing her hand against the kitchen door, Beth pushed it open. "Jesus, Moll, have you been in here? Kitchen's sick, isn't it?" Hearing the change in her sister's voice, Molly followed. The doorway had opened to reveal a kitchen that was almost empty but perfectly clean. The smell of bleach hit the back of her throat, and oddly a bucket of steaming hot water stood to one side of the room, a mop leaning against the wall beside it. To disperse the smell, Molly leaned over the sink, unlatched the window and pushed it open. The action caused a breeze to rush through the kitchen. A door slammed. The house shook, and Molly nervously spun around on full alert. "What the—" Instinctively, she pushed Beth behind her. "What was that?" With a pounding heart, she hurriedly grabbed at the mop, made her way to the utility door, stood perfectly still. Holding her breath, she allowed her hand to hover cautiously over the door handle. With her eyes fixed, she waited for the handle to move. "Moll, please don't." Beth took a step backwards, the colour slowly draining from her face. "Earlier, when I was by the car, I told you I heard something and you didn't believe me, did you?" A shared glance was followed by a look of fear as flashing images of their mum flew through her mind. Her unknown visitor, her subsequent murder, the pain they'd gone through. Trying to swallow, Molly's mouth went dry. Her breathing slowed. The taste of bile rose dramatically in her throat. "Beth, it's probably nothing. Probably just the niece. She'll have been cleaning, saying goodbye to the place. Now, you stay there and—" She tried to sound convincing, felt her fingers tightly wind around the mop as she looked around for a better weapon. Finally, she took a deliberate breath, pressed the door handle down, and jumped backwards as a utility room was revealed. The back door was wide open. Swallowing hard, she watched it creak eerily back and forth in the breeze, a set of keys still hanging in the lock. Their owners nowhere to be seen. Chapter 3. Recoiling, I quickly move into the shadows and hide in the undergrowth as I hear your voice yell out. Your footsteps approach, and I hold my breath as a surge of euphoria builds in my chest. Holding my hand over my mouth, I try to hold back the laughter and fail miserably
as what started as a mere snigger bubbles up until it erupts into an overwhelming, unrestrained laugh, and I suddenly feel thankful for the storm, for the waves, the sound of which easily drowns out any noise I might make, makes it easier to move around, to get closer to where you both stand. Half of me is fearful I'll be seen. The other half wants you to notice me, and I try to think up a plan, a reason for being here, and a million stories flash through my mind. Fidgeting with anticipation, my feet step back and forth in the mud, and I wonder which story you'll believe. And I quickly realise that the idea of stepping out of the shadows, revealing myself, excites my mind, especially when I know what I've just done. Looking towards the shed, I see the rolled-up carpet. It's partially hidden down one side. A few logs and an old sheet of corrugated metal are balanced on top, along with an old spade I found in the shed. The irony of the find doesn't go unnoticed, and I quickly realise how useful a tool it will be. Feeling a sense of power that I never want to lose, I continue to press my hand tightly over my mouth and smirk as I see a pair of pale, bare feet poking out from within the rolls of carpet. They're the same feet that tried to kick me, the same feet that went limp as I squeezed the last breath from her body. And I'd smiled, felt as though I were holding onto a balloon that had suddenly begun to deflate itself, right before my eyes. Then, without warning, my mood drops. Anger takes the place of euphoria, and I realise that it was an unnecessary death. She shouldn't have been here, shouldn't have interfered. Today of all days, I should have been here alone and allowed to search, to look for what I know he hid. But she wouldn't let it go, wouldn't give me the keys, didn't believe I'd been sent to collect them, and for that, she paid the price. I couldn't risk her speaking to you, telling you I'd been here. And now I have the problem of hiding her body, of disposing of her. And I roll my eyes skyward to watch the rain, and I wonder if I should have left her in there, in the house, took my time to search, and then, instead of cleaning the kitchen to cover my tracks, I should have burned the house down with her in it. Aching for the euphoria to return, I pull out my phone, wait for your back to be turned, begin taking photographs, one after the other, and feel the power I have over you, over your life, your future. It's a power I can't live without, like a wild animal searching for food, for its next meal, to ensure its survival. Whereas you don't even realise that you need to survive. Not yet. You don't know how close you are to losing it all, to taking your final breath. It's something I never wanted to do, not to you. I was hoping you'd disappear while you had the chance. You could have taken Beth with you, started a new life. But instead, you came to this house, to the one place I never wanted you to be. And in doing so, you sealed your own fate, because now I have no choice but to kill you both.
Chapter 4. Thanks for that, Beth. Thanks for what? Beth stood behind her, hands placed smugly on her hips. She made every attempt to look past her, around her, and into the garden. For letting me practically break down the front door when the back door was open. Huffing, Beth spun, stamped through the kitchen towards the hall. What do you think? I'm bloody psychic. How would I know the door was open? Trying to keep calm, Molly thought of the noise, how her sister had disappeared around the back, knew that if the door was open now, it must have been open then. She began counting to 10, her stomach twisted, and she felt nervous that Michael's niece could still be around, that they might finally get to meet her. After all, they had spoken on the phone on numerous occasions. And strangely, Molly did feel inquisitive, wanted to know what she was like. Especially after the frosty calls, where Carol had made it very clear that the house should have stayed in the family, that her father had helped Michael build it. The fact that she wasn't pleased had been quite an understatement, leaving Molly to wonder if she'd left the keys hanging on purpose, It was as though she'd had no intention of a face-to-face meeting and certainly hadn't made a point of welcoming them with open arms. Pulling the keys from the lock, she turned them over and over in her hand, studied the ladybird keyring that was still attached. Puzzled, she decided that it looked expensive. It was something Carol might want back, and nervously, Molly inched onto the doorstep, looked out, waited. The oncoming storm was getting closer, the sky full of clouds and the moon hidden from view, leaving the garden looking darker, more sinister, with darker, deeper and more foreboding shadows than she'd hoped. She found herself standing on her tiptoes and trying to look around corners without actually leaving the safety of the house. "Carol, are you out there?" She tossed the keys onto the worktop, cupped her hands around her mouth, shouted over thunderous waves that hit the rocks below, and eventually she took a step out. A step closer to the shed. "Carol, it's Molly Winter. Are you—" She was going to ask if she was in there, if she'd popped outside for a moment, but as the heavens opened and the rain began to fall in torrents, it was more than obvious that if Carol had been in the garden, she'd have been seen running for cover. Jumping inside the shed, Molly sheltered from the rain. She listened to the way the rain pelted against the roof, and with eyes as wide as saucers, she scoured the roof, searched for holes. She kept an eye on the back door, on where Beth had previously stood. Wrapping her arms nervously around herself, she shuddered, noticed a few random logs, an old coal scuttle half full of black oval rocks. It didn't look like the coal she'd known as a child, but she was sure it would burn, and for that she felt thankful. "Yay, Beth! We will have a fire tonight," she yelled, bent over to pick up the logs, and then froze as she heard a loud, deafening bang, felt the shed door slam behind her. There was only a small polycarbonate window to give her some light. Pushing at the door, she felt its resistance, felt her heartbeat accelerate, her throat suddenly dry. "Beth? Beth?" Her voice echoed back at her, the hammering of the rain on the roof enough to drown out any sound, and once again she thought of Michael, of how he'd have lain on the patio, all broken, in pain, with no one to help. Her whole body began to tremble. Her stomach faltered, threatened to rid itself of her lunch, and she began taking deep yet rapid breaths. Nervously she pushed at the door, then pushed again. Something was stopping it. Something or someone had slammed it behind her, and in temper she began to kick at the door. Could just about see through a small hole where, over the years, the wood had disintegrated. "Beth, seriously, I swear to God, this is no time for games." Blinking, she held her breath. Felt sure she could hear boots on gravel. Tried to peer through the polycarbonate window. Gave her head a short, sharp shake. "It's getting to you. You're finally imagining things," she whispered to herself, thrust herself onto her feet, and with a newfound energy she kicked at the door, began to hammer against it with tightly coiled fists. All right, I'm coming," Beth's voice shrieked. Her footsteps splashed through the puddles, and suddenly the door was thrust open. "What the hell are you doing in there?" Her eyes were wide, her face a mixture of shock and hysterics. "What did our mum always tell you about going into strange buildings on your own at night?" She stood back in the rain, her hands on her hips. "Well, come on," she laughed. "I've found the fuse box, lights are on, and the living room, it does have a fire, so—" She looked down, spotted the scuttle. "Great, you found some coal. I'll go make a start on the fire." Pausing, Beth picked up the scuttle. "Oh, and you might want to know, removal van is here. He had to reverse the whole way down the lane. His clutch stinks like molten rubber. He's shouting about how he could have burned it out, and oh boy, he really isn't happy." Running for the house and locking the back door firmly behind her, Molly stood for a moment, stared at the shed, at her temporary prison. She couldn't help but wonder what had really happened out there. All she did know was that Beth was capable of anything, especially when she wanted her own way. And right now, she wanted to make sure that this house was the last place either of them wanted to be. Chapter 5. Determined to get Beth on side, Molly pulled the duvet up and under her chin, snuggled as close to her sister as she could get. gave her a loving squeeze. "See, I told you we'd be okay, didn't I?" Since arriving, the job of moving them into the house had been exhausting, even with the help of the 2 grumpy removal men, who between them had moaned about every single item they'd carried in. The boxes had been too heavy, too wet, the path far too slippery, their vehicle parked much too far away, and if anyone had told them how difficult the lane would be, they'd have probably had to charge even more than they already had. And now, some 6 hours later, Molly and Beth were both lying in their makeshift bed, a double mattress positioned on top of a rug in front of the fire, with their mum's 2 settees surrounding them like a fortress. One stood down the side of the mattress, with the other along the top, serving as an impromptu headboard, with a small space at the bottom of the temporary bed where they could crawl in or out, albeit only on their hands and knees. "At least we got the room nice and clean." Molly stretched, rubbed her back, which still ached from the vacuuming, mopping and de-spidering, all of which had been done since the removal men had left. The mattress had been stowed in the hallway, carried in last, then carefully positioned between the 2 settees. Leaning against the pillows, they both gazed longingly through the long, curtainless window that during daylight would have given them the most perfect view of the entire bay. But right now, the view was distorted by the rain and hail that thrashed against the glass, along with the darkness beyond, where the faded lights of Filey intermittently poked through the thick, murky sea fret, making Molly grateful for being inside. Even though the fuse box had been found, they'd turned the lights off and were lying in the firelight, with just a small number of carefully positioned candles to give a warm and cosy ambience. "Do you remember when we used to do this with Mum?" Beth pursed her lips, pulling at the duvet. "It was the closest we ever got to camping, wasn't it?" Molly slowly nodded. She remembered moving to the refuge, the times they'd all shared the same bed because there had been no other option. It had been a quiet Sunday morning, with Molly reading a book and Beth sitting beside her at the table making a house for her dolls. It had stuck in her mind quite clearly because of the way their mum had been nervously pacing up and down, cigarette in hand, ash so long it arched toward the floor, before finally dropping off to land on the already grime-covered carpet. Then, without warning, there had been an explosion of noise. Mum had screamed, ran towards them as though sheltering them from the sight of what appeared to be an army of police that had stormed through the house, all in search of Charlie. "He'll be hiding in the loft," their mother had yelled. "You'll find him up there." Her finger had pointed to the stairs, while she'd cowered beside the table, clinging to Beth. Then, just a few minutes later, Molly remembered the emotions that had whizzed around in her mind as Charlie had been unceremoniously pushed down the stairs, out of the house, and into a waiting police car where his screams and threats could be heard from a distance, even after the vehicle's doors had been slammed. She'd felt both relief and dread all at once. Relief that for now he was gone, but a sickening dread that once he returned, he'd make them pay. After all, they were threats he'd spat at them so many times before. Times when moments of terror had turned into what had felt like hours of violence. The way he'd struck out, his face contorted with so much anger that his eyes had bulged and saliva had dripped from his screaming, drunken mouth, and then, just a few hours later, how he'd always begged for forgiveness, promising it would never, ever happen again. They were moments that Molly would never forget. Moments that had haunted her since. Times she'd thought him about to kill them all. She felt grateful that Beth had been so young, so naive, completely oblivious. Pulling Beth towards her, Molly dropped a kiss lightly on her sister's forehead. "Our Mum looked after us the only way she knew how." A sob left her throat as she wondered how much Beth remembered. "She had no choice. You do know that, don't you?" Beth nodded, her eyes brimming with tears too. "The day it all happened, the day we left for the refuge." She watched, waiting for Molly to nod before continuing. "I didn't realise that was it.